Hello, everyone, and welcome to this IANA webcast, Inside the Numbers, Quarter 3, 2020 review of the economic and market conditions that we're looking at today. It's great to have you all here. I really appreciate it. I would like to start out by thanking our Platinum sponsors. They help us out year-long, and they are sponsoring this particular webinar. So we are very much appreciative of their support. So a big thank you to them. To get us started, just a quick agenda. Our friends from TTX are going to walk us through the general economic conditions right now. Take a look at the 2020 IANA numbers year-to-date through September, which is the most current. And we'll take a little deeper dive into international and domestic intermodal, what's happening there, and then wrap it up with a Q&A, as I mentioned. So today we are really lucky to have kind of a dream team of industry experts with us. John Woodcock, the Director of Market Development at TTX, Pat Casey, who is the principal at PJC Economics, and Peter Wolf, the Director of Market Development at TTX. We'll turn it over to Pat. We'll let you take it from here.
All right, so COVID-19 has been a big impact on the recession that we've seen. Economic contraction in the second quarter is the most severe since the Great Depression. There was a significant increase in the third quarter, up about 75% after being down in the second quarter. The government support of the economy was strong at first, but stopped recently, and we'll see where that goes over time. And emergence and acceleration of new modes of spending, notably e-commerce, and that is a big part of the intermodal increases that we've seen recently. The near-term outlook is also very unpredictable. We'll have to see where COVID-19 goes. Supply-side nature of the recession, business closures to address public health risks, ties economic growth to the path of the virus. Recent improvement in the labor markets is encouraging, but still well above pre-COVID-19 when unemployment was a 50-year low right before that, and potential to bring back some manufacturing production given high unemployment levels. And as many of you may know, last year, there were many efforts to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., but were not anybody available to be employed for that, and that didn't happen much. But now that many people are more unemployed, that could help. So one of the things that we really enjoy looking at the U.S. economy back to normal index, it bottomed out in April and has slowed, recovered since then, but still not back to normal, still right around 80% for that index. And Moody's and CNN put this together, and they use lots of daily and weekly data about that. And fortunately, one of the things that they use for that data is the AAR weekly intermodal volume in the US. So very good that they take a look at that as part of it. So US GDP, as you've seen, had been rising about 2% quarterly for several years. Then most of the decline that we saw in the second quarter of 2020 was consumption, and mainly consumption of service. And also note that all of this is annualized, and so it didn't just go down 33.1% in the second quarter, but that was annualized in the second quarter to see that, and then turned back up in the third quarter and is expected to fall 4% for the full year. And we'll see where that goes in the fourth quarter too, as COVID-19 is turning back up a bit. So the next one is e-commerce. Spiked in the pandemic, and it continues to rise. It was going up quite a bit before COVID-19. It was trending up for a long time, then a big surge up since March. And even if COVID-19 goes away, still more of this maybe here instead of those stores. We'll see where that goes over time. Will people who have just started to buy e-commerce, will they continue to do that when stores are open again? And certainly welcome any questions about that later. So industrial production rose with the reopening of the economy, but utilization remains low. And this had been slowing down prior to COVID-19 in 2019, and now is much lower and could may come back manufacturing to the US. We'll see if that happens and it pulls that back up again. And you see that utilization percentages are not very much from where they were in the past, even though they were fairly low relative to the long time. So the unemployment rate had gone up quite a bit early in the year as COVID-19 came up, and many services had a shutdown, and that was a big part of it. As you know, restaurants and theaters and concerts and all kinds of things were down quite a bit. And also, even though unemployment has turned down quite a bit from where it was in April, it's still much historically high going forward, and we'll see where that goes. So the last slide I have shows you the forecast of many things. We talked about GDP. Consumer spending is expected to go down 3.9%, but that's almost all for services. Durable goods are rising 6.9%, non-durable goods 2.9%, but services are going down this year 7.2%, and that is about 2/3 of consumer spending is services. So we'll see where that goes. Retail sales, you see, are up slightly, given that investment way down. Housing starts very steady going forward. Vehicle production and sales down quite a bit, but that's probably going to turn up next year. And industrial production you've seen is down quite a bit too. Then Mexico and Canada GDP, which is part of our intermodal, is both lower than the US. And not because they've made bad decisions, but because for both of those nations, it's very much more based on trade and oil production as a share of GDP compared to what the US has. And that's pulled that down. And then finally, you will see inflation has dropped down from right around 2%, which is where the Fed wanted that to be. And we will see if that turns up too next year, but it's very low compared to where it's been for many years. So that's the introduction to the economic section. Thank you.
So hello, everyone. It's Peter speaking, and thanks, Pat, for the economic summary, and thanks to everybody for joining in today. So John and I are going to talk about the numbers for a few slides, and then I'll talk a little more detail about international intermodal, and John will talk about domestic after that. So the slide that we have on the screen now is a summary of year-to-date to September intermodal volumes for various market segments and various regions. And as you think about the monthly growth rate since January through September, that shape of the growth curve really resembles the shape of the back to normal curve that Pat just showed on slide 10. And by that, I mean, intermodal volumes in January and February were roughly flat to slightly ahead versus 2019. And it's more or less where at least TTX's forecast thought that they would be. Certainly there were warning signs that COVID was coming, but in terms of impact to the North American economy or transportation, January and February were months where there really was little impact. Of course, March hit and intermodal volumes started to turn negative, particularly impacted by supply chain disruptions in Asia from COVID. And then April, May, and into June, we saw additional supply chain disruptions from Europe, as well as demand disruptions, right? Huge demand disruptions in the North American economies as people quarantined. But then in June and into July, things really started to pick back up. And so comparing July of this year to July of last year, imports themselves, domestic containers and trailers all showed positive growth in the month-over-month numbers. And then international intermodal, or IPI, started to turn up in September. So as the economy returns to normal, we were seeing that in the data, and intermodal was slowly returning to normal as well. And then John's going to talk about the next slide, if I can get it to advance.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. This is a slide of the units version of what Peter was showing with just the percentages. And it really doesn't, this is year-to-date numbers, of course, and some of the numbers look fairly lackluster, but the year-to-date numbers really don't do justice to what an impressive third quarter performance the intermodal market had. And I apologize, we don't have the actual third quarter comparisons on here or October, but I can give them to you verbally. So as you can see that for a year-to-date, trailers were minus 9.8% year-to-date September. But in the third quarter, trailers had a really impressive performance of being 20.8% positive to the same period in 2019. And for October, it was a similar experience where we had a 20.2% gain on a year-over-year basis, October to October. Domestic containers also did very well, not quite as well as that, but of course we're starting at a much higher base and a much more robust market size. But in the third quarter of 2020, domestic containers themselves were up 11.1% for the quarter versus 2019, and in October, domestic containers were up 7.9% for the month on a year-over-year basis. Finally, on ISO containers continued to struggle into and through the third quarter. While you see here year to date was minus 11% performance for the first 9 months, the third quarter itself saw a negative 6.5% volume turnout on ISOs versus 2019. But we did finally have a positive month for ISOs in October, where the IPI traffic was up 5.8% versus same period in 2019. Okay, Peter, back to you on slide 19.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Alan. I think what we want to show on this slide is across all the regions, volume is down. And of course, this makes sense. It's a pandemic. So the East, the South, the North, the West, pick your region, Canada, Mexico, every place was down. Overall, through the first 9 months of the year, volume was down about 5.7%. And in the Midwest, which has a 27% share of all intermodal originations, was down 5.8%. Southwest, again with a large share, 18% share, down 4.1%. Southeast with a 13% share is down 6.8%. So all of the major regions are down roughly the same amount, between 4 and 5, 6%, reflecting the global pandemic and the widespread impact throughout all of North America. So I think, but there are some exceptions to that, which is what John's going to talk about on slide 20 and 21.
Yeah, so thanks, Peter. So on slide 20, we have some of the positive growth corridors, and then on 21, we'll have some of the negative growth corridors. So really quickly on these, I won't spend too much time on this, but in the third quarter itself, we did see some more positive growth on the Northeast to Southwest corridor. In fact, the growth for the quarter was 7.5%. And in October was an additional 3.5% gain. We believe that's probably having to do with empty repositioning of domestic boxes back to the West Coast, but we're not sure if that was an educated guess. And similar to that, if you look at the bottom number, the Midwest to Northeast, it was relatively flat in year-over-year growth for the first 9 months. But in the third quarter, we saw a 9.2% growth quarter over quarter for Midwest and Northeast. And then we actually saw a 12.3% gain on a year-over-year basis. That may be in part due to traffic coming off the West Coast and moving transcon and being affected by steel wheel interchanges, where you actually get a bit of a double count scenario where the Western Road interchanges of not steel wheel, rubber tire, where the railroad interchanges to Eastern Road on a rubber tire and a rebill occurs, so you get a bit of a double counting there. So we go to the next slide. So here are the biggest corridor declines that we saw in the first 9 months of the year. Most of these have actually improved. We do see some negative still in some of these corridors. The one I want to point out that's really been most negatively affected this year is the intra-Mexico. For the third quarter, intra-Mexico down 25.7% on a year-over-year basis. And in October, it was down 48.3%. We believe that's largely due to strike actions and blockades that some of the unions down in Mexico are enacting against the railroads. The railroads are innocent bystanders in these actions, if you will. It's more for pay and job security issues. But they've had strikes at some of the major ports, including Lázaro and Cardenas, as well as up in the Northeast. That's affected rail traffic to a significant degree. Hard to call them because they're sporadic, and they've been popping up Mexican rail network for the last year and a half or so. So Peter, how about we dive right into the international side of things?
That'd be great. So for slide 23, this is showing that demand curve shape that I mentioned earlier. And, January and February, demand was a little bit less this year, which is the orange line, than 2019. But that was expected just because of the change in the date of the Chinese New Year and when shipments come in, rather than anything induced through COVID. But then you can see in March that things started really to turn south. And that was really a supply chain disruption from China. April, interestingly enough, imports from China rebounded, but still below, total imports were still below last year's level as orders were being cut back because of COVID. And then in May, that's really when the bottom fell out. Imports were down 20% for that month compared to May of last year. But then in June, things turned back up, still negative for the year, but improving. Again, in July, things were getting pretty close where July imports crossed over. And then in August, we started to see imports grow on a month-over-month basis for the first time. In October, just jumping to the end rather, U.S. imports were up 19.3%. And year to date for October, imports are only down 0.3% for the U.S. So our full year forecast at TTX is imports will be up slightly for the year, about 0.5%. Pretty amazing considering where things were in May and where we thought things were going to be back in April and May. And as we have discussed many times on these calls, the key driver for international intermodal is simply the import volume itself. So you need a strong amount of imports coming in to hold up strong import or IPI demand. And Hal, if you could flip it to the next slide, and we can start to talk a little about the logistics practices that impact international intermodal. And one that we always watch is all water share, which is what TTX define imports that originate in East Asia, which would be China, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, countries in that neck of the world. What percent of those imports land on the US East Coast versus the US West Coast? And interestingly enough, all water share declined about 3 or 4 share points, which is about 10% of the volume over the summer and into the fall, which is because shippers needed imports quickly. As Pat mentioned, demand for durables was up about 6.9%. Demand for non-durables was up almost 3%. So that put a lot of pressure on bringing product in faster. And if you go all water, that adds anywhere from 7 to 10 more sailing days. So the West Coast is faster to bring the goods in, and we saw that shift. Looking in the next year, in November and December of this year, we think all water will revert to its former practice. So there'll be about 37, 38% of imports that originate in East Asia will land on the US East Coast. And why we watch all water and why we think it's important is that if imports land on the West Coast, there's about a 70% chance that import will move inland by rail. On the other hand, if the import lands on the East Coast, there's only a 20 or 25% chance that import will move inland by rail. Where tariffs are going to go is anybody's guess with the new administration, but we can talk about how tariffs impacted intermodal volume last year and this year as well. So this is a slide that we showed in August, and sorry to be repetitive, but I think it illustrates what happened last year. So in 2019, because of tariffs, imports fell from China roughly to a tune of about 10%. But that volume was made up in other East Asia, imports from South Asia. South Asia would be Bangladesh and India, and imports from Europe. And again, if an import originates in East Asia, it's going to have that same trend of 65% or so will land on the US West Coast, and then a 70% chance it'll move inland by rail. But if it originates in South Asia or Europe, there's a 90%, 95% chance it's going to land on the East Coast, and that only has a 20 or 25% chance of moving inland by rail. So overall volume was not really affected by tariffs, but where goods were made and what coast they landed on, and therefore international intermodal, that was definitely affected by tariffs. That was last year. And Hal, if you'd advance it one more slide. So what happened this year? It seems that COVID just scrambled the supply chains. So if you look at maybe to towards the right of the screen where you see 1Q20, share from China really dropped precipitously. But that was really because they stopped making goods because of COVID, as opposed to tariffs inducing movement away from China to other places. And you can see in the second and third quarter, China's actually regained share of import volume. So tariffs really haven't had a whole lot of impact about moving production away from China this year to other places in the world. Now, what happens next year? Could that 2021 look like 2019, moving production away from China? That could happen, but will tariffs remain? We'll have to see what the new administration is going to do. So let's talk about IPI, or International Intermodal itself. Despite the recovery of imports, and despite all water share moving back to the West Coast, at least over the summer, International Intermodal has not fared well this year. Through September, IPI is down 11, and for the full year, we expect IPI to be down about 8.5%. So things will recover a little bit in the late third and fourth quarter, but not enough to offset the losses that we saw earlier in the year. So what's driving the weakness in International Intermodal? I would say it's two things. One, to some extent, not a huge amount, but to some extent, it would be transloads. So year to date, September in the Pacific Southwest, transload volume is up 3.7%. And transload share of imports coming in the Pacific Southwest, which are the ports of LA and Long Beach combined, that climbed to 36.6% year to date compared to last year, which was 33.9. So call it a 3-point share gain, about 10%. But that jump, I think, really reflects the volatility of the imports rather than a signal from shippers that they're changing their logistics strategies. And so it's a little bit hard to see, but I want to point out that from March's trough to the September peak, both IPI and transload volume, so that would be the black line and the blue line on the bottom, those have risen about 45%. So relative to each other, transload and IPI haven't gained share or lost share to each other. But the number that's really been volatile is the orange line, which is imports. And imports from the March trough to what we're seeing now in September and October, those have gained about 90%. So imports are up 90, IPI and transloading grew about 45. Why are imports growing at twice the rate of intermodal? Is intermodal somehow losing share? Is this a bad thing? And I think the short answer is no. Anecdotally, what we hear from a lot of shippers is that there's a lot of restocking going on in Pacific Southwest warehouses. We're not hearing, John's going to talk about this a little bit more on the domestic side, but we're not hearing about a lot of trucking activity that's gaining share. There's certainly a lot of trucking activity, but it's not gaining share versus rail off the West Coast. At least that's what we're hearing. So what we think is going on, there's a lot of inventory being built up in LA Long Beach, and that could mean that we'll see a lot more transload volume late this year, early next year. So it could be a good sign. But I think getting back to why IPI is down, I think the main reason is simply there's a different mix of traffic, mix of imports that are coming in over the summer and the fall compared to last year, and really driven by COVID. So as Pat talked about in the economic section, that durables and non-durables on the consumer spending are all up, but industrial production is still relatively soft. And that shows up in the data. So the box on the right, we're seeing that auto parts through September, imports of auto parts were down almost 40%. Imports of tires down almost 6%. Well, those two commodities, as well as a lot of the other industrial commodities, tend to move IPI inland, versus the commodities that are up are all consumer goods, and those have a tendency to transload. So it isn't so much this big shift in people don't want to ship IPI anymore, it's that the commodities coming into the country aren't moving IPI. As an example, through September, well, this is showing that auto parts were down 37%, but even in September, auto parts were down almost 20%. It was only in October that auto parts showed a positive year-over-year growth of nearly 25%. And interestingly enough, that's when IPI was showing a lot more growth. IPI grew almost 6% in October. So it's not a coincidence that imports of auto parts and other industrial goods are picking up in the fourth quarter, and that shows a link to IPI growth as well. And so I like to call this my Department of Redundancy department slide. This is a graph which is the same as the table that I just showed you, but it just, like I say, lays that out in a little different format. And you can see that auto parts are the category of imports that were the most decline year to date in terms of volume. And as those pick up, we can expect international intermodal to pick up. And so you'll see a returning more to normalcy of the relationship between IPI and import volume. So this is just showing our forecast for IPI for the year. And second year in a row, unfortunately, we expect IPI to be down. Looks like it's going to be down about 8.5%. Again, the fourth quarter, we're showing some pretty solid growth, but it's not enough to offset the weakness we saw, particularly in the second quarter, particularly in May, where imports and IPI both sank like a rock, falling over 20%. And so I'd like to turn it over to John, and we'll have time at the end for questions on international intermodal. And John will talk about domestic.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So I'll just jump in and give a little color on what we're seeing is happening in the domestic side. So conditions this year really have transitioned from being very lackluster to how low can it go, to a pretty smart rebound in early summer, to growing demand that really has some parallels with 2018. Activity is such that domestic container loading in the third quarter beat 2018's third quarter by nearly 89,000 units, or 4.4%. In October itself broke all-time domestic container volume monthly records, with that set in October of 2018 by 24,000 plus units, or about 3.3%. So October was a record-setting month for domestic container loadings, which is really quite surprising given overall economic conditions. So as Pat mentioned, business is being driven in part by the diversion of consumer spending away from services to goods. And the consumer's ability to spend has also been helped by the government stimulus programs that are starting to wane, and possibly we'll see a resurgence of that in the beginning of the year, particularly with the new administration. The strength in domestic loadings off the West Coast in particular really indicate a correlation between brisk imported consumer goods activity and the rising e-commerce businesses that we're seeing. The West also looks to be the primary order fulfillment location for direct-to-consumer e-commerce orders. And I say that it was advised to us when we started seeing this earlier in the year. But I say that given that the surge in trailer loadings has largely occurred in IANA's southwest region, which includes the LA Long Beach area. The intermodal trailer space is increasingly dominated by parcel and LTL carriers, and e-commerce has spiked in the second quarter. It went from over at a 16% share of total retail sales from about 11% in 2019. It's according to the Census Bureau, it subsequently fell to about 13.5% of total retail sales in in Q3, but we're expecting it to rise again over the winter months should shutdowns again become more widespread as COVID takes hold. Of course, with product flying off the shelves need to be refilled. And the U.S. Census Bureau also reports on inventories and inventory to sales ratios. Those inventories right now remain well below historic norms, particularly in the retail space. And it's expected that restocking-based transportation demand will continue possibly into the second quarter of next year. So the demand overall is pretty good between retail spending, the disjointed supply chains, as Peter was referring to, as well as the restocking phenomenon that we're going to see into next year. So in many respects, this is an interesting time for intermodal. But if you start looking at some of the industry statistics on their own, such as today's diesel fuel prices, you might conclude that there could be some headwinds for intermodal marketers. In fact, what we're seeing is that the trucking industry itself is facing its own challenges, and that those challenges appear to be growing with time. Driver capacity has again become a nagging issue with the carriers. In fact, I think you could classify it as being the issue for the carriers in 2020, and it will be the issue in 2021 as well. The industry needs a steady supply of about 100,000 or more new entrants just to maintain capacity, and that's according to the American Trucking Association. And in 2020, however, driver inflow has slowed. Driver schools, which graduate 50 to 60,000 new drivers annually, have been affected by the COVID-19 epidemic, similar to other learning institutions. And according to the CVTA, which is the Driving School Riding Association, they have seen a reported 40% decline in productivity this year. They're expecting it for the full year, to be more accurate. Meanwhile, the driver outflow, so those are the drivers that are leaving the industry, that's actually increased due to retirements and COVID concerns. And FMCSA's new drug and alcohol clearinghouse has really exacerbated departures. As of today, December 1st, I would estimate that there's over 43,000 drivers that are in prohibited driving status due to positive drug tests and being placed into the clearinghouse. And this number has been growing pretty steadily at 3,000 to 4,000 additional drivers per month. So this is a statistic that just began the beginning of 2020. Alarmingly so, most of those drivers affected and in prohibited status, rather than choosing to follow the process for reinstatement to full driver status, they appear to be choosing to exit the industry. I believe the statistic is about 75 to 80% of all of the drivers that have been flagged for drug violations have not started their return to service process. So it looks like this number of out-of-service drivers is going to increase over time. So the driver crisis obviously will be with us through 2021. The longer the pandemic, the harder it's going to continue to be for driving schools to get new entrants on the road. And as long as demand stays buoyant, I'd expect further driver pay increases to become more common in the trucking industry and keeping rates elevated in the transportation space. So this is a quick look at the survey-based Morgan Stanley Truckload Freight Index. That is a mouthful. And this provides a really nice glimpse at the ever-changing balance between truckload demand and supply. The points higher on the y-axis indicate tighter conditions. And as you can see, conditions have slightly moderated since Labor Day holidays, but the dry van space generally remains a seller's market, with supply constrictions expected to continue into the middle part of next year at the earliest. We'll probably see tightness in the market through the year. And that's assuming that there's going to be continued government stimulus and the economy continues to hold. With regard to capacity in the trucking industry, we're always looking at the driver situation, but we also look at the capacity from the equipment standpoint, particularly with Class 8 truck orders. You can see this is very much hill and valley. It's a very cyclical market over time. And we went into an extended subdued period that started back in October of 18. But with the rising profitability that we've seen in the second half of this year, I think there's been more confidence on the part of the trucking industry, and they're starting to order trucks again, particularly after the bottom of the market back in May, where only about 4,000 or 5,000 trucks were ordered in 1 month, about a quarter of which is a typical order month. So we believe a lot of the power units have been sidelined up until late. And while we're not seeing any data or getting feedback from the market that would indicate any equipment shortages at present, we think this is a more robust purchasing cycle that's emerging, and it's going to be covering the soon-to-be needed replacement capacity that'll be phased out of service or cycled into the secondary markets in 2021. And this increased purchasing will hopefully stem tightness on the equipment supply into next year. Going to the intermodal equipment side, domestic container purchases were pretty muted this year after about a 6% growth spurt in 2019. We only saw about just over a 1% growth in 2020. And of the approximately 4,000 unit adds that we identified this year, most were delivered to new rather than existing fleet owners. While we don't have an official forecast for 2021 yet, I'd expect the growth number on this side to be less than 1%, just maybe a hair under 1%, maybe 0.8 to 0.9%. And so it's still going to be muted. We feel that generally speaking, the market on the dry box side, at least, the market is right-sized to absorb volume increases in 2021. So here's just a quick illustration of the containers that came into the market in the last year and a half. So you can see that it's mostly new fleet owners. Temperature controlled containers have taken particular gains, and that's had quite an impact on trailer loadings on the temperature controlled side, which used to be about 30% plus of the trailer market. And I'm guessing that, doing guesstimation that the reefer side of the trailer market is probably down in the mid-teens right now. Although not all of the reefer participants have fully transitioned over to a container product, and not all of the major participants in the trailer temperature control segment have actually stuck their toes in the water with regard to containers. So it still has a ways to go, but we believe this is going to be a continuing trend of containerization away from trailers. This is just a summary of our domestic container volume outlook for the remainder of the year. We're expecting the year to end at slightly positive performance of being about 2.8% above 2019. I guess you could say this is really no mean feat. It's fairly muted in its growth, but it's no mean feat considering that this level of growth actually exceeds the expectations that we had even when we entered 2020 pre-COVID. So it's pretty impressive performance all around. The trailer volume also exceeded our expectations. We were expecting double-digit losses in this market in 2020. We're expecting now an overall decline of about 5.3% this year, even though we're seeing double-digit positive comparisons in the second half of the year, and it's being carried largely by the e-commerce folks. It's really not enough to overcome the 20% plus losses that we experienced in the first half. And so in conclusion, overall domestic volume, we're expecting to be up about 1.6%. Incredible on its face, which is 1.6% growth, but really incredible given the year's events. Peter, are you going to address this?
Sure. So what we're keeping an eye out, we always have this section at the end, is pretty much what we've been keeping an eye out all year. And it's really what's going to be the path of the virus and how is that going to impact the US, Canadian, and Mexican economies, as well as what's going to happen with government stimulus. Is that going to are things going to be passed that will offset the negative impacts of COVID? And it's just hard to think about exactly what will happen other than there's going to be something and we just have to watch it. Almost nearly impossible to do a forecast or a prediction of what government stimulus will be or what the path of the virus will be. So it's kind of a weaker than usual what we're watching section because we just can't predict these two things. But so it makes forecasting rather challenging as we've all come to realize this year. So that's pretty much our presentation. Hal, if you want to turn it over to questions, we'd be happy to answer questions.
Thanks, fellas. That was great. Talk about a wild ride.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But finishing in the positive numbers is a nice way to round it out. So that's good. Thanks for that good news. We got some good questions. I'll start off by probably the most speculative, and this one's for Pat, kind of talking about your economic colleagues in the new administration. The attendee's asking, from what we've seen, the economic team that President-elect Biden has named, does that telegraph any approaches to the economy that we might be looking at from presidential administration?
Well, that may be some, but one of the things I've always said is, the president is not the biggest impact on the economy. It is Congress and the Senate and the Federal Reserve all have a bigger impact on the economy than the president does, of any president. So we'll see where that goes. Does that make sense?
It does indeed. It does indeed. Thank you. Here's another one. You kind of touched on it, but so the trailers are down again and kind of continue to slide back down. Does that in some way show that e-commerce has transitioned over to utilizing containers more than they were using the trailers early? Because it seems like they had an affinity for trailers early on, but does that indicate maybe that they're moving to boxes?
Well, I think all of the big parcel players have their own fleets of containers. The nice thing that trailers provides, and it's very apparent this year, is they provide a flexibility or surge capacity. And so, the business roared back very unexpectedly in May and June into the summer months. And it's not possible. There's only a finite number of boxes that are available in the market, and the boxes are built in China, so there's a long lead time and able to replenish capacity or capacity to the market. And trailers are out there, so it's easy for some of these big LTL and parcel guys just to grab more trailers and put them into the intermodal service. With regard to the actual trailer business being down for the year, it's actually up substantially, and that's really being driven by the parcel play and e-commerce. And what's amazing is the strength in the e-commerce and the parcel and the LTL is really offsetting the losses that the trailer market has sustained due to the migration of temperature control traffic away from the trailer market and into the container arena.
Interesting. Thanks, John. Here's one, this is kind of a crystal ball-y one. Will e-commerce still be robust for intermodal in 2021? And if so, any whys associated with that?
I'll start off on that. E-commerce and its impact on intermodal is a source of constant conversation in our office or on the phone nowadays. And it seems to have it certainly pushed a lot of the parcel business to rail. As I made in my comments, that we are seeing that there's a lot of e-commerce fulfillment on the West Coast, and that gets put into individual packages for consumers and then gets shipped parcel. And that is arguably, I guess, from my point, it's a less efficient way of distributing product through the country. Instead of a pallet of widgets, each widget package that goes on the van to be delivered to the hinterland. But generally speaking, we see that e-commerce has been a net positive for intermodal, but we're really still in the early stages of trying to completely understand what the true impact of e-commerce versus brick and mortar is to the intermodal supply chain. Peter, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think another piece that we're trying to sort out is what's the inventory building piece versus the sales piece, and whether that's related to e-commerce or not. And so it's four different pieces, right? It's inventory for a brick and mortar store, inventory for e-commerce, and then retail sales for each of those channels. And how does that affect intermodal demand? So it could be that we're seeing a lot of intermodal shipments being related to inventory fulfillment. And once that inventory gets built up, say sometime next year, you'll see fewer intermodal shipments. Maybe, we don't know. Or maybe everything that's moving right now is simply related to that 6.9% growth in durable goods spending. And as long as there's durable goods spending, we'll see the same amount of intermodal intensity. So, but it's kind of, we'll know in hindsight, because John and I are brilliant in hindsight. The foresight is always a challenge, particularly for me. But but I always have a keen grasp of the obvious. So when we see the data looking backwards, it'll give us, I think, a better understanding. But there's certainly been a lot of supply chain disruption this year. But at the end of the day, it's clear that e-commerce helps intermodal volume. It doesn't detract from it.
It's also interesting to point out how that e-commerce is a bit of a it's not a clear definition. So when a lot of people think of e-commerce, they think, oh, it's Amazon bringing a package to my doorstep. Well, a lot of the e-commerce that we've seen in the second quarter, particularly, and later in the third quarter, has been things that you order online and you go to the store to pick it up. So it's a brick and mortar sale in the true sense of the word, but the transaction is done electronically, and so logistically it's handled by like any other brick and mortar sale, but actually counted as e-commerce because it was an electronic transaction.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think some of our traditional definitions need to evolve because the realities are outstripping our ability to use what is now dated terminology, I guess, to really kind of reflect what's happening in some cases. Here's one that's digging into sort of kind of fundamental question, I guess, around strength of the dollar, and what's the impact on trade flow, and do you guys foresee a strengthening or a weakening and a consequence of the trade impacts or flows? I mean,
yeah, we do see a weakening of the dollar strength over the next few years, and that does raise the price of imports. So that does help to reduce that somewhat, but it also lowers the price of exports. So that could be more as well.
Here's one. Do you guys have any insights on the expansion of Eastern Canadian ports and how that might impact the intermodal market over the next, say, 3 to 5 years?
Short answer, no. It's when you say Eastern ports, Montreal is the second largest port in Canada, and there was a strike in August, and it was fairly disruptive, and that pushed the imports to discharge in the Maritimes into St. John in New Brunswick, and a lot into Halifax, and then all those containers moved intermodally to the interior of the country. So that was kind of a plus for intermodal, a one-time hit. As to where that goes beyond, I know that there's some discussion about building a new port in Quebec, near Quebec City. Whether that brings in more imports into Canada or whether that just diverts imports from the existing Canadian ports in Montreal and Halifax, I'll let the marketing gurus for those ports kind of fight that one out. Generally, our assessment at TTX is if you add a port, it doesn't necessarily create more volume. It does can shift flows. So we'll have to, but I don't know if that port's going to get built. And I know that there's some discussion about that. So we'll watch and see how that all develops.
Watch this space. We'll be back in the spring and see if we've got any more info on it. Little teaser. Here's a question about census. So when do we expect to see the 2020 census data available for digestion? And how could that factor into the revised 21 forecasts?
I'm not sure when that's available. I'd have to look that up, and it could have an impact on the forecast.
And I guess it would depend on what the Supreme Court says about who gets counted.
Sure.
Right.
So that's really a very hot topic, very timely. So thank you, listener. Will retail stores continue to morph into mini DCs around the country? And do we see the changes that we've seen from COVID carry over into a post-COVID where we might have more of this curbside pickup, mixed e-commerce and brick and mortar, and it's sort of all kind of blending together?
I would think so. I mean, I think it's a convenience, right? Especially for the next generation, that this is what they're used to is online shopping. And whereas, my wife and I might spend the weekend running errands, you can now do all that online. So it just shows up at your door, and now you have more free time. Again, as to how that impacts the intermodal intensity, it seems that e-commerce doesn't hurt intermodal. So whether you have your goods delivered to your home, whether you go to a store and pick up goods that you already ordered, or whether you do old-fashioned shopping, it seems that intermodal is going to be not negatively hurt by any of these distribution channels. John, you want to add it?
Yeah, I was just going to say consumers love choice, right? So I think that I can't imagine many of the big box retailers or the multi-product retailers like Target or Lowe's or Home Depot, they're always going to be looking for more ways to serve their customer and giving them more choices on how to buy and pick up their product, as opposed to eliminating more stores, et cetera. So, and with regard to the first part of the question, with regard to DCs, kind of a hybridization, if you will, of the retail store and DCs. We're not experts, so I won't claim to be an expert on that. I would say it's a factor of real estate prices and how much real estate footprints cost in particular locations, as to whether it makes sense for them for a retailer to combine a retail location as well as a distribution center. Obviously, we're seeing a lot in malls where shops are redundant because of the growth of e-commerce, and some of them are being repurposed into distribution centers for final mile distribution.
And there are many forecasts of things continuing after COVID-19. Certainly, e-commerce and also people working from home quite a bit. Business travel much lower than it ever was. Those kinds of things.
That makes sense. Well, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time. We've got a few more questions that we're not going to be able to get to, so my apologies to those folks. First of all, I would like to thank the three of you for digging into the data and digesting it for us and sharing those insights with us and talking us through it. Many thanks to all of our attendees. Thank you very much for spending a little bit of your time with us. We know your time is precious, and we appreciate the time that you do spend with us. If folks are interested in learning a little bit more about the actual data that helped feed into some of this insight that you were able to witness today, you can actually get that data yourself by subscribing to the ETSO database. We also have a tool called the Volume Analyzer that helps you do quick analysis on those numbers. So if you want to learn some more stuff about those tools that are available to you, head on over to intermodal.org or give us an email at info@intermodal.org. Again, I'd like to thank our platinum sponsors for supporting this program. They really do a lot to help make this possible, and a lot of other educational opportunities for us. So thanks to them for their support. And with that, I will say thanks, everybody. Please continue to be safe. Wear your masks. They're effective, and they're they're intermodal. They're intermodally based, so support your local economy and wear your PPE. So with that, I will bid you all adieu. Be well, be safe, and take care.